Well, much to discuss with these latest developments. Joining me now from London is Helen Thomas. She's the CEO and founder of Blonde Money. She provides financial and political analysis. With me here in the studio is Garrett Martin. He's a lecturer at the School of International Service at American University, joining us from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And joining us from Chapel Hill, North Carolina is Klaus Laris. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, Johns Hopkins University. And with us too from Florida is Remy Pierre. He is a research associate at the EU Center at the University of Miami. Welcome to all of you to the show. Garrett, you heard the news. As Donald Tusk said, two scenarios there. So there's basically two deadlines. One is April 12th, the other is May 22nd. What happens now? Theresa May takes this back to the British Parliament.
Yes, correct. I mean, now we'll have to see, will there be a third meaningful vote? Now, we have to remember that the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, said that for there to be a meaningful vote, there would have to be a substantial different bill. Now, there are still ways around this. I think the arithmetic is still going to be rather challenging for Theresa May. Let's remember that even the second time around, she still lost by 149 votes. It does not seem as if there's a fundamental difference next week. It certainly was not helped as well by a speech yesterday where she essentially seemed to be pitting the people versus the members of parliament. So I think there's going to be a lot to follow, but it's also not clear whether there is a majority in the House of Commons for any solution.
What kind of flexibility does she have, Garrett, in terms of putting a new bill before parliament? What can she change?
Well, I think it's difficult because fundamentally, I mean, the EU27 have already said that they are fundamentally against changing any key terms of the withdrawal agreement. So she doesn't really have much flexibility on that front.
Because on the one hand, you've got the Speaker saying, if you bring the same bill back, it's not going to happen. She's got to do something, but the Europeans are saying it's already done.
Well, she's definitely between a rock and a hard place. You know, I won't disagree on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think technically, if the will of the House is to have another meaningful vote, yeah, I think there is a way around the opposition that the Speaker has put forward. But I think it's still going to be fundamentally the same challenge of finding some kind of majority around any solution. The House is very divided across very different tribes that want very different outcomes. I am not clear, unless the Parliament wrests control away from the Prime Minister, I'm not convinced that we can have any passage of a vote next week.
Helen Thomas, what are your thoughts on what's just transpired? The British Parliament, as we know, voted Mrs May's proposal down twice. Is this just kicking the can down the road again?
I'm afraid it is just kicking the can down the road again, and as you were just hearing, the parliamentary arithmetic is very difficult, and tonight doesn't really necessarily change too much about that. There is a fundamental schism, a crack in British politics between effectively the Remainers and the Leavers, and this is, of course, the divide that Theresa May has been trying to bridge simply even within her own party, let alone with the other parties in Parliament. And of course, you know, it was a 52-48 vote. It's a very split public. So, you know, trying to bridge all these divides would be incredibly difficult for a skilled leader with a long track record and a huge majority. And of course, she doesn't have any of those things. So I'm not too sure that tonight from the EU changes any of that for her.
And where would this leave her politically, Helen?
Well, she's incredibly weak, as we know. She appears to be almost like, you know, the expression is a cat with 9 lives. She appears to just keep on bounding forward, even though, of course, she struggled with a confidence vote from her own party about her as leader, and then a confidence vote with the entire House of Commons. But I would say, and this is important, that part of the reason she continues to survive is nobody actually wants to take on the role at this point from her. It suits a lot of people, whether they're opposition parties or if they have a strong Brexit view. It suits them for her to carry the can on a bad Brexit. And unfortunately, as tough and as cynical as that sounds, that's how politics works. And there are many people who kind of need her to stay in place and to own what has become a very nasty political football.
Okay, let me bring in Klaus Laris. Klaus, what is your assessment of how the EU has been handling this? They've been very firm up to now on those dates, but we see today they've agreed on 2 new dates. Do you think they are now prepared to show a little bit of flexibility?
Well, I think they are showing as much flexibility as they can. There has been so far a united front on the part of the EU, and there was actually some friction between Angela Merkel and Macron, the French president, today. But in the end, a unanimous vote was agreed upon. And so the deal now, as you said, is to give Theresa May a little bit of time to get her act together and to get the votes on her side. I do think, and I agree with Gareth, that a vote will probably be held next week. Some way around that will be found. Whether she has the votes or whether she will get the majority of votes for her deal is, of course, very questionable. And I think it really depends on the DUP in Northern Ireland. If the DUP says that they can agree with her vote and vote for the withdrawal agreement she has negotiated, then I think the European Research Group, or a large majority of that Brexiteer group, will also vote for Theresa May's deal. So it really depends on what the DUP is going to decide to do. And the government has been very active in bribing the DUP, and I think that word is not too strong. They have offered millions of pounds, put millions of pounds on the table, which will go to Northern Ireland if the DUP agrees with the deal. There's also been talk that that Stormont, the Northern Irish Parliament and the executive, will be strengthened, that they will get more authority in domestic legislation, and all that will help to bring the DUP around. And of course, the DUP, as many other parties in Britain, don't really want a no-deal exit. So, you know, it's a cliffhanger, and I think the DUP will probably support Theresa May, and that may get her over the threshold, and that may get her to get her deal approved. I've actually just recently heard about rumors that tomorrow senior members of the Conservative Party will ask her to resign, with effect from probably May or maybe even June. But her time as Prime Minister are certainly over, and it is only a matter of weeks, really, when she will be replaced. But the big question is, of course, who will replace her?
Right. Rémi Pierre, the French President Emmanuel Macron, he's been taking a very hard line on this. In fact, talking earlier, he said that, he issued a warning. He said that Britain's heading for a no-deal Brexit. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The first thing is that we have been negotiating the withdrawal agreement for 2 years. It cannot be renegotiated. The second thing is that in case of a negative vote from the British, we will go towards a no deal.
What do you make of what Macron had to say there, Rémi Pierre, and of these two new proposals that have been announced?
Well, the thing is, Macron faces himself as the new leader of the European Union. He has a very ambitious agenda for the European Union that this whole negotiation of Brexit or no Brexit is actually delaying. He's been several times saying that he wants the European Union to, tackle issues of, influence of China, moving forward on a common defense, all those different, intensification of the European construction that are now not on the table because everybody is looking at the Brexit negotiations. So basically, he's fed up with those negotiations. He also has clear complexities in domestically with the series of demonstrations. For him, the European elections that will be held in May are very important because they will potentially reinforce his legitimacy as president of France inside in domestic politics in France. Now, keep in mind that when Theresa May arrived to Brussels, her first priority was to try to get a delay up to June 30th, so beyond the European election. That was something that was not acceptable to Macron and to most of the European leaders. What they achieved to say right now is that if the UK is not ready to sign right now the deal and get ratified by Parliament, then they will have to be participants of those European elections, which will be very interesting to look into in terms of who's going to be presenting candidates and what will be those positions, and will that represent a new position from the European people, from the British people towards the European Union. The second thing was really to reinforce the fact that this text that was agreed between the European Union and Theresa May would not be changed by one line. And when you look at the statements today that's been signed an hour ago, which is a one-pager, it clearly says that there's no potential renegotiation of that agreement between Theresa May and the European Union. And that actually places the member of the British Parliament in front of their responsibilities, now either to sign it or to decide before April 12th to participate in European elections. If not, then automatically the possibilities of a further delay, a long delay, will be excluded, in the very words of Tusk.
Gareth, getting back to what could take place in London in the British Parliament in the days ahead, you were saying earlier on that the that Parliament could wrest control away from Theresa May of this? How would they do that?
Well, they tried already to sort of get an amendment, and it was narrowly defeated. I think it was an amendment put forward by Hilary Benn, one of the Labour MPs, to basically have Parliament have more of a chance to provide indicative votes to see if they can come up with an alternative majority for a different kind of solution. That, for instance, could be, which is a will at least of some parts of the Parliament, towards a softer Brexit, which might look more like a customs union, for instance. So I think it's certainly possible that they could get some sort of an amendment. And now, with this sort of changing context, I think with the worsening of the situation, with Theresa May, I think, losing further support even within her party, it's not impossible, because the margin of that vote was so close and narrowly the government survived. So it's not impossible another vote could lead to a different outcome.
Oh, talking about losing support, I mean, you mentioned a moment ago the fact that she essentially blamed Parliament for what was happening. This is what she said. Let's take a listen to what she said.
It is high time we made a decision. So far, Parliament has done everything possible to avoid making a choice. Motion after motion and amendment after amendment has been tabled without Parliament ever deciding what it wants. All MPs have been willing to say is what they do not want. I passionately hope MPs will find a way to back the deal I've negotiated with the EU.
You know, as Klaus pointed out, there have been these reports all day, rumours rather, that she's not going to last until the beginning of summer.
I think that seems very likely. I mean, I agree. I think it was one of the panelists that, in a sense, for the moment, her protection is that nobody wants to be saddled with the responsibility. Right. So as long as that happens, I think that will be of help. But the moment there seems to be some kind of clear outcome, I think she will either resign. I think she probably sees the writing on the wall, and to be honest, probably needs a break. I can imagine these have been very testing times for the Prime Minister, or she will be pushed out by a cabinet. But in either case, I would be surprised if we see Theresa May as Prime Minister, you know, as you mentioned, in the summertime.
Helen, well, it's got to the cliff edge right now, and in fact, there was a prominent Leave campaigner in Britain, politician Nigel Farage, who said on the BBC earlier that it's now much more likely that there will be a no-deal Brexit. Would that be the case? Would there be a no-deal Brexit right now?
That's actually what I'm looking for, despite what we've seen from the European Council tonight, because unfortunately, we are on the track towards no deal because of the activation of Article 50. This is the legal process by which the UK does leave the European Union, and it is a legal process. And we activated it. It got the date 2 years from that point, which is 11 p.m. on the 29th of March. Now, it looks like that might move along until this point in April, but that's not necessarily a given thing either, because you still have to get legislation changed. That is still quite complicated and a difficult process. And until it is done, which it's expected to happen at the beginning of next week, but we'll wait and see. Until we know that, then we cannot be sure that there will not be a no deal on the 29th of March. And even if we can move things along until the 12th of April, then we still are in the same problem just a couple of weeks later, because, as I say, it's like a train on a track. It's going towards this destination where the UK leaves the European Union, whatever happens. And to stop the train going down that track, you have to pull the lever, and a majority will have to pull that train onto a completely different track. And as yet, although a lot of people have said they do not want it to carry on down the path to no deal, they haven't said what it is that they do want. And that, in fact, is obviously what Theresa May said in the clip that you just heard there. And it is going to be quite difficult for a majority to agree on anything, quite frankly, because it is a very divided Parliament.
Klaus Laris, Remy Pierre talked about the European elections earlier on. This is what Theresa May said about those elections.
The idea that 3 years after voting to leave the EU, the people of this country should be asked to elect a new set of MEPs is, I believe, unacceptable. It will be a failure to deliver on the referendum decision that this House said it would honour.
So, Klaus, how do the EU elections play into the urgency to resolve this crisis?
Well, the EU obviously wants to have members of the European Parliament which have been elected. And if the UK decides to leave for the time being, but without electing new MEPs, then that would really be a parliament which wasn't fully valid in the legal sense. So any legislation passed by that parliament could be challenged in court, as some of the MEPs represented in that parliament would be unelected. These would be the British ones. Therefore, the urgency on the part of the EU to get the UK to make a decision whether they will be part of the EU after May or whether they will leave before the elections. And I think that is fully understandable on the part of the EU. And I think Theresa May also realizes this urgency and this requirement. But I'm a little bit more optimistic that there might not be a no-deal exit. I think eventually, probably sometime next week, if her deal does not obtain the majority she hopes for, then probably Labour, the Labour MPs in Parliament and some Remainers, a number of Remainers from the Conservative Party may try to get an extension or to provoke Article 50 and to basically get an extension to Britain remaining in the UK and ask the European Parliament to get a long extension to that, perhaps a year or even longer. And once that has been agreed, then I think it becomes ever more unrealistic to base a decision to leave on something which has happened 3 or 4 years ago, which then may lead to a second referendum. And in my view, personal view, I think a second referendum is still the most sensible option there is.
Okay, we'll get that into to that in a moment. But Theresa May has been talking in Brussels in the wake of that statement made by Donald Tusk. This is part of what she had to say.
What the decision today underlines is the importance of the House of Commons passing a Brexit deal next week so that we can bring an end to the uncertainty and leave in a smooth and orderly manner. Tomorrow morning I will be returning to the UK and working hard to build support for getting the deal through. I know MPs on all sides of the debate have passionate views, and I respect those different positions. Last night I expressed my frustration, and I know that MPs are frustrated too. They have difficult jobs to do. I hope we can all agree we are now at the moment of decision, and I will make every effort to ensure that we are able to leave with a deal and move our country forward.
Remy Pierre, listening to Theresa May talking there, and she spoke just a few minutes ago, there's nothing new in what she had to say, was there?
Well, there's nothing new because she's in a situation of gridlock right now. I mean, the position is very difficult when she faces a European Union who is very strong on solidifying the construction of 27 countries together. So basically, let's look back at what happened over the last few months. Basically, the European leaders were extremely keen on protecting the economic basis of the European Union by saying clearly that to the UK, if you want to leave the European Union, you're welcome to leave the European Union, it's your right. However, you cannot be also part of the single market. You're not going to be able to weaken the foundation, the economic foundation of the European Union. Now it's on the political level, saying that if you want to be, leave the European Union, you can, but if you want to stay longer, you will have to participate in the European elections to be elect different MPs. And so basically, Theresa May is facing this very clear and strong position from 27 countries that agreed unanimously, which is something quite impressive when you actually look at 27 countries together, agree on those rules. And she has no other option than to go back to London and clearly press our Congress members to agree either on a plan or then to participate to the European elections. None of these actually were a favorite situation down the road.
Garrett, Klaus mentioned a second referendum. Do you see any kind of scenario in which that could happen?
I'll have to sort of slightly disagree on that note. I don't think a second referendum or actually a no deal are the most likely option at this stage.
Right.
I think a second referendum would be politically very difficult because essentially you would be telling the millions who voted in June of 2016 that you are ignoring what they did. Now, even if you think it's not sensible anymore, I think it would be really a significant political risk. So I don't really see a second referendum really happening at this stage. I will note, though, however, that what we just heard from Theresa May, it was interesting to see the tone, even the content was not significantly new. At least there seemed to be a realization that maybe her choice of words yesterday was not ideal, so maybe at least trying to placate the members of Parliament. I will also note, I think, one of the factors which we'll really have to keep in mind for the next meaningful vote when it happens, meaningful vote 3, is do MPs start believing that this is really the last chance? When they voted recently on March 12th, I think they knew, many at the back of their minds, that there might be the chance of asking for an extension, and this might not be the last word of the Parliament. Now, if they come to believe, and I think there's a strong sense that they might, will that affect the outcome of the vote? So that remains to be seen.
What is your feeling on that, Helen, that this is make or break right now?
I think that is a really key point there about make or break, because actually you need the time pressure to force people into a decision. And it may be a decision for many that is a very bad one that they don't agree with personally or politically. But if it's pushed into a real deadline focus and it's my deal or no deal, that would certainly concentrate minds, and that would have helped Theresa May to get that vote through. And in fact, now that there is this possibility of different kinds of extension, unfortunately, it removes some of the pressure. So in a way, all the time, we need the choice to become binary. The choices have been too many. There have been too many options. And we talked earlier, one of the panelists said about indicative votes. And, you know, with those, we're going to see where people think, great, I can get my vision of Brexit out there. We can do what I want to do. But you have 650 people, and they all have a different opinion and a different process. And somehow you have to force them to coalesce around basically a binary choice of yes or no, and we still don't have that, not as this stands at the moment. And actually we do need that to happen so we get to the real make or break. But we are clearly getting towards the end of the process, and make or break is getting much closer.
Klaus, very much most of this, of course, is uncharted territory, but the British have been preparing for a no-deal Brexit. In fact, we're hearing that they have an operation called Operation Yellowhammer to deal with any crisis caused by a no-deal Brexit. In fact, British armed forces have set up something of a command centre in a bomb-proof shelter. All sounds very dramatic. I mean, what are the British expecting here?
Yeah, it is very dramatic. And of course, no one really knows what the effects of a no-deal Brexit will be. You know, there are horror scenarios with long lines of trucks on the coast and clogged streets and no food and no other provisions in British supermarkets. And there are the voices of the Brexiteers who say, don't worry about it. There will hardly be any effect, just some, you know, a few days of transition and everything will be just fine. We have no idea what really will happen. But, you know, in view of the British government preparing quite thoroughly in almost a warlike manner, as if they were back in the trenches of the Second World War, preparing for an onslaught, I think, you know, that probably indicates that they are deeply worried about the economic effects. And today there was a joint letter by the Trade Union Council and by the business community warning Mrs. May that the economic effects on the country would be absolutely disastrous. And I guess they have some good reason to worry about that.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Time's caught up with us. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for being with us.